Tragedies and Controversies. Rick James was an iconic musician, and his music was legendary to say the least. But the life of Rick James was filled with drama, tragedies, and controversies. At one time, Rick James used to operate as a pimp in Toronto. After this, there was a celebrity hairdresser who was known as Jay Sebring, who offered to invest in the music career of Rick James. The opportunity was so lucrative that it was not something that Rick James could miss out on. As a result, Jay Sebring invited Rick James together with his girlfriend at that time, who was known as Seville, to a certain party that was to be held at the house of the famous film director Roman Polanski. This big party was supposed to be hosted by the pregnant wife of Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate, who is also an actress. When the day of the big party came, Rick James woke up with a very crazy hangover, as he had overpartied the previous night. His hangover was so debilitating that he could barely move. Due to this, Rick James had to miss out on the event. The following day, when Rick James woke up in the morning, he received some very shocking news about the party he had missed. According to the news, there was a cult leader, who was also a musician who failed in his music career, who went by the name Charles Manson. This cult leader had instructed 4 of his followers in his cult to walk into the house of Roman Polanski and take the lives of each and every person who was inside the house. All the occupants in the house, everyone who had attended the party, including Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring, were all taken down in some very ugly scenes. Rick James realized that his debilitating hangover had saved his life. This is because if his hangover was less severe, Rick James, together with his girlfriend Seville, would have both attended the party, and they could have been among the scores taken down by the 4 cult members. The name Rick James was not actually his real birth name. The man would start his shenanigans when he was still a young boy. When Rick James was 15 years old, he was about to be drafted into the military and serve in the war in Vietnam. His real birth name was James Ambrose Johnson Jr. After James realized that he might be drafted to the war in Vietnam, he had to come up with a plan, because the thought of the idea of his going to Vietnam scared him to bits. As a result, he conjured up some lies, and fortunately, these lies worked, and so he found his way into the Naval Reserve. It was not long before the young man managed to dodge the Naval Reserves too. Speaking on Buffalo News, Rick James said that he could not take the regimentation and conformity. Instead of doing that, his time would rather get spent on drumming for the local jazz groups and abusing substances. James Ambrose Johnson Jr. got placed on active duty in the military in the year 1964. Instead of reporting for duty, James Ambrose did the one thing that a normal person would do: run to Toronto, Canada. While he was in Toronto, he used to live with Joni Mitchell and Neil Young. Together with Neil Young, Ambrose James decided to form a band that went by the name Mina Birds. This band would get an extra ounce of luck, as they were signed with the famous record label Motown Records. While James was at Motown Records, he managed to meet with Stevie Wonder and performed for him. Stevie Wonder was very impressed with the skill that James exhibited, and so he asked him for his name. Instead of saying his real name, he told Stevie Wonder the name Ricky James Matthews, which at that time was his alias, as he was still running from the law. Stevie Wonder suggested to Ricky James Matthews to shorten the name to Rick James, and that was where the name came from. He would later on get arrested as he was still a fugitive. His arrest would lead to the sudden end of his band, the Mina Birds. But as for Rick James, the enigma was just getting started, having made his name through running from the law. At one time, Rick James almost set himself on fire. To think that it was only Richard Pryor who was capable of setting himself on fire would be crazily wrong. Just as Richard Pryor set himself on fire while freebasing in the year 1980, Rick James would find himself in a similar situation 10 years later. This was after a very long beef between Rick James and MC Hammer. The two arch-nemesis would later put their differences aside and decided to work together. They would even find themselves together sharing the same stage at the same time. As a result, one feel-good moment led to another. And this time, Rick James decided that he was going to blaze some crack. The dealer who used to supply Rick James with this kind of stuff was known as Race Newman. Race Newman would describe the Inferno incident, where he would state that when Rick James was attempting to burn smokable crack pipe residues, he managed to set a plate ablaze. Rick James did what any other person holding a burning plate would do. He started walking around with it. He suddenly dropped the plate, and his robe was caught on fire. The flames went up his robe, going all the way to the sleeves, and just like that, Rick James was up on fire. His supplier, Race Newman, would extinguish the fire, and James, still smoldering, picked up the plate as if nothing had happened and took it into his room. When Rick James was 43 years old, he attended a party with his young future ex-wife by the name Tanya Ann Hijazi. While Rick James and Tanya Ann Hijazi were at this party, they met with a 24-year-old lady by the name Frances Alley. Rick James, Tanya, and Frances Alley were engaged in a friendly conversation. During this conversation, Rick and Tanya learnt that Frances was unemployed at that time. As a result, they decided to welcome Frances Alley to stay with them since she did not have a job.